G'day, I'm Rowan Mackey and welcome to Individuate, the podcast where we use the vehicle of starting our own podcast to try and get the best out of ourselves in the service of others. Today, we're talking about choosing a topic. Now, this is a pretty broad subject and one that will likely be unpacked over the course of this podcast series. This is a pretty central theme to the idea of individuation, and I think it relates a lot to the idea of finding your calling. So it's not something that I'm keen to try and pick off completely in one episode today, but we'll go over some of the general principles and some of my thoughts on it. Before we get into the podcast today though, I want to tell you about how one man's simple question changed a practice that had been around for thousands of years. Primo Levi was an Italian chemist and Holocaust survivor. In 1942, he found himself working for A. Wanda Limited on a project attempting to extract anti-diabetic medicine from vegetable matter. It soon became clear that the project had no chance of succeeding, however, but it was in no one's interest to say so, as he was working at the Swiss company at the height of World War II, and his research allowed him to escape the race laws that existed in Italy against Jewish people at the time. During his time at A. Wanda Limited, his research led him to a book containing the commonly used recipe for linseed oil. The practice of using varnish such as linseed oil is an ancient one and goes back as far as the Bible, when God told Noah to coat the interior and exterior of his ark for protection. As he examined the recipe, a curious Levi was surprised to find towards the end of the recipe for this linseed oil an instruction to add into the mixture 2 slices of raw onion. Being a chemist, Levi couldn't understand what quality the onion gave the oil, and so he inquired with everyone that he could. He asked factory managers about why they continued to expense the purchase of onions, but none of them could give him a straight answer. He asked labourers. Many had seen minor adaptations of the recipe throughout their careers, yet none of them could satisfy his desire to understand the exact purpose of the onion in the recipe. After 7 years of wondering why the onion was included in the recipe for linseed oil, spending time at Auschwitz concentration camp in that time, he asked Giacomo Olindo, who was a mentor of Levi's. Olindo was aged into his 70s and had been making linseed oil for 50 years. Olindo explained to the inquisitive Levi that when he was a young man, he had to boil the oil himself, and because it was in the days before thermometers, you would judge the temperature of the batch of oil by observing the smoke, spitting into it, or more efficiently, immersing a slice of onion in the oil on the point of a skewer. When the onion began to fry, the boiling was finished. As the years went by, what was once a simple measuring device had been transformed into a magical and mysterious practice. And even though there was absolutely no reason for the onion to be added to the linseed oil recipe, many people had continued to do it without questioning its exact purpose, until one chemist came along and had the audacity to question a practice that had been established centuries earlier. I want you to hold this story in mind as we talk about today's subject, choosing a topic, because we want our podcast and perspective to be unique. Sameness doesn't evoke emotion, and one way of being unique is to challenge the status quo and position yourself outside of an orthodox view to stand out from the crowd. It's also worth recognising that when creating your podcast, you don't just want to replicate what someone else has done. We can do almost anything we'd like with our podcast, but it's worth having a rationale for why you do things in a particular way, rather than just copying someone else's recipe, onions and all. Today's topic is a bit of a tough one in certain ways, because podcasting is still a nascent art form. It doesn't yet have the years behind it to develop the same conventions and traditional ways of doing things such as other media, like TV or radio. That means that essentially, we have free reign on our podcast. But in recognising that most podcasts don't make it past the 5-episode mark, evidently, there are some things that we should avoid to ensure that our podcast will enjoy longevity and popularity and create a return on investment many times more than we would have if we'd done only a couple of episodes. It seems to me that many of those podcasts that discontinued early are just trying to replicate what they think a podcast is meant to be. They hadn't determined some of the purpose behind their podcast, and then they fell by the wayside upon realising that they didn't have the tools or confidence to continue, and their heart wasn't in learning out how to gain that. This is why the first stage in our signature 7 Steps to 10 Apps course is purpose. It's really worth predetermining some of the motivators for your podcast and aligning them exactly with where you want to go before you start. But how do we decide what we're actually going to talk about? In his book, The Big Leap, Gay Hendricks categorizes our activity in life into 4 zones. The first zone, the zone of incompetence, is made up of all the activities we're not good at. We may have no experience with the activity, and we're inherently unskilled in that area. The next zone is the zone of competence. This involves all the activities that we know how to do pretty well, but there are others who can do them just as well. In this zone, it's hard to distinguish your capabilities from others in any way. Next is the zone of excellence. In this zone, you are doing something you're very skilled at. Often this zone is cultivated, and it takes time to learn the skills and gain the experience to stay within our zone of excellence. And so it can be tempting to stay there. But the final zone, outlined by Hendricks, is the zone of genius. Your zone of genius is your special set of activities that are uniquely suited to you. These activities draw upon your special talents, unique experiences, and individual strengths, and satisfy you in a way that seems to answer your calling in life. If we look at a midlife crisis, for example, often coming between the ages of 38 and 42, in my opinion, a midlife crisis is in response to someone not working within their zone of genius. If we go back to the spiritual problem identified by Carl Jung that we spoke about in episode 1, more people living below and not reaching their zone of genius and not being able to properly satisfy their calling in life likely contributes to this idea of the spiritual problem. That's where I think podcasts are such a powerful tool, because we aren't limited or constrained to our zone of excellence. We can answer whatever call to adventure is deep within us and can avoid some of the massive issues that come with prolonged unfulfillment in life. This idea of the zone of genius was called genius by the Romans, daemon by the Greeks. You might see it referred to these days as your calling or your purpose, but it goes beyond just what we're good at. The Academy of Ideas describes this phenomenon as an unconscious psychological complex, a functional cluster of ideas, emotions, and associations which exist beyond our conscious awareness and which influence our conscious mind through irrational means. The daemon guides us in the direction of our purpose through intuitions, fantasies, sudden urges, synchronicities, and dreams. Now, we're getting pretty deep into some of the complex psychology involved in this stuff, and although it's definitely something that I want to unpack as we go through the podcast, but we probably don't need to go too deep into it today. The important thing that I want to get across is that in starting a podcast, we have an absolutely incredible opportunity to explore some of this stuff. And we're always looking for ways to create longevity in our podcast. The closer we can get to this zone of genius, the longer our podcast is likely to last and the more people it's likely to influence. There's also a couple of other benefits when operating inside this zone of genius. Firstly, you get to spend more time in your flow state, which is the state of fluidity between mind and body, where you're so deeply absorbed in a task that you're beyond the point of distraction and don't really notice the passing of time. There's a whole range of psychological benefits that come from spending time in a state of flow, but if we look at it practically, if we're wanting to create a podcast that lasts, the effortless momentum that comes with being in flow will allow us to find constant inspiration and help us to come up with work that's unique. Also, we'll seemingly have so much extra time compared to someone who's spending a bit more time labouring over their content. Another benefit of operating within our zone of genius is that our work is infinitely harder to replicate. If we're drawing on a set of deeper experiences, values, and motivations than someone who's just trying to replicate a concept, we'll have so much more to work with. One way that I like to think about this is, what are the masts that you're prepared to nail your flag to? What are the deeper problems, themes, and messages that are important to you and will deeply fulfill you if you're able to pursue them? This is also where I think the link between individuation and podcasting comes in. If we go back to the different elements of individuation that we spoke about in episode 1, the best podcasts, in my opinion, are the ones that tap into something deeper than just the presentation of the persona. Whether it be considering elements of the collective unconscious by tapping into the zeitgeist, or recognizing the motivating factors within our personal unconscious that define what's important to us, the podcasts that can incorporate a deeper meaning are often the ones that do the best. So let's test this theory. In 2020, one of the top podcasts in the world was the Joe Rogan Experience, where comedian Joe Rogan interviews a range of people, from comedians to academics to cage fighters, about basically any topic that's relevant to that particular discussion. On the surface of it, it seems quite irreverent. It just looks like a jock comedian who's also prominent as a mixed martial arts commentator, just using his fame to access and interview a variety of people about a whole range of unconnected random topics. But last year, the Joe Rogan Experience got about 200 million downloads a month. So how is it that Joe Rogan is able to create such a deep connection with his audience? I want to read a snippet from an article in The Atlantic examining Joe Rogan's popularity. This moment in American history is not rich with role models for men. Plenty of the role models that men choose for themselves draw eye rolls from everyone else, or dire warnings, or hashtag cancel tweets. Men have spent centuries earning this degree of suspicion, but if we're all going to make it through this era alive, men do need alternatives to look up to. So many of the skills and professions from which men have derided self-worth for centuries, and still do, are going obsolete in a hurry. Even Toy Story 4 is about an aging white man struggling to find purpose in a world that seems to have no use for him. Meanwhile, the irony is that many of the men who demonstrate a level of intelligence and empathy worth aspiring to, they've pretty much all been on Joe Rogan's podcast. So, love him or loathe him, as many do, Joe Rogan has recognised that his long-form interviews, often around 3 hours unedited, offer something to his audience that satisfies a deeper craving for purpose. And so, although he spends a lot of his time, arguably too much of his time, talking about bow hunting, eating elk, mixed martial arts and other activities associated with a particular type of man, he's recognised that he's able to offer something much deeper than that. And this offering has been recognised and accepted by people all over the world. In marketing, there's a saying, nobody wants a drill bit, you want a hole. I think this is the same with podcasts. In Joe Rogan's case, the drill bit is long-form, live interviews that might appear on the surface to lack substance and virtue. However, in recognising what Rogan is really on about, it becomes easier to understand what he offers. He's able to tap into something deeper than his whimsical interest, and I think his popularity is evidence of this. Philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche said, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." I think this is what he meant. If we can link our podcast to our deeper motivation for being, then it's so much more likely that we'll persevere. So what's the deeper motivation that's going to help you get through the dark night of the soul in the podcasting process and allow you to continue when you get stuck? Because the statistics and a whole bunch of incomplete podcast feeds show that many people aren't able to identify exactly what that motivation is. As my mentor, Ronsley Vaz, says on his podcast, entitled Should I Start a Podcast? Every single change in human history can be traced back to a point where a speech changed enough people's minds to make a difference. With the technology today, people's attention span, and the ability to connect with someone with their auditory sense, no other platform can compete with podcasting. This idea is further explored by Canadian psychology professor Jordan Peterson, who said about YouTube and podcasts, "For the first time in human history, spontaneous speeches can reach an infinite audience for an unspecified duration of time, and maybe it's easier for people to listen than it is for them to read." Again, I come back to the notion that we have such an incredible opportunity in starting a podcast, but there's an element of responsibility that comes with that, if we're to properly respect the medium and ensure its continued success. I think part of that responsibility comes with considering our deeper why for starting a podcast and pursuing something that's genuinely meaningful to us and our audience. The other thing that happens when your podcast involves some of the deeper themes that you're on about is that each episode helps to crystallize certain notions and make them more concise. If you're truly interested in pursuing a cause or creating a movement, how valuable can it be to concise your messages down and make them as accessible as possible to people? It's also worth noting when picking a topic that we have to do something that's going to be sustainable in a commercial sense. If you're already selling a product or a service that can fit into these ideas that we've spoken about, then maybe you can sponsor your podcast and use it to get clients or customers. Maybe you could use the podcast to enhance your customer experience and in turn charge more based on the extra material you can offer and the further specialized knowledge you've developed. If you don't yet have an offering or way to monetize your podcast, you may want to consider how you would at some stage. But it's interesting, as of 2020, 90% of the S&P 500, so 500 of the biggest companies in the world, 90% is categorized as intangible assets. That's either intellectual property or what's called goodwill. This is up from just 17% in 1974. So there's clearly a movement towards monetizing intellectual property and capitalizing on positive reputations and good branding. To me, there is no better way to develop our intellectual property and gather goodwill than a podcast. We'll talk about monetization more a bit later in this podcast series. But for now, just recognize that we want our podcast to last. And ideally, that means making it commercially sustainable. So, before I finish today, there's just a couple of other quick points that I want to bring up before we move on to another topic. The first bit is a bit ironic. After all we've spoken about today, you don't actually need to choose a podcast topic. Another option is just choosing an angle. An angle is an overarching theme or idea. So, for example, in my first ever podcast, I'm Loving Your Work, the angle was that I asked people, when you were a kid, what did you want to be when you grew up? And then we chatted about what they actually did do from there. Whatever angle you choose, it's worth including something that people can take away, whether it be a skill or a message or even just an intention to do something or to be more mindful about something. It's in providing these takeaways, like Jordan does in his podcast, that we're able to ensure that we're building in value for our intended audience. The other point to note is that it's worth being mindful of how you'll actually entertain your audience. How will you elicit the emotion needed for your audience to connect with your topic or angle? Will it be with stories, with particular questions and conversation topics in interviews, or will you choose another way? But with whatever your podcast is about, it's important to remember these notions. How will I entertain? What can my audience take away from my podcast? And how will I elicit the emotions needed for a deeper connection? As we spoke about last week, with all that being said, it's worth keeping our audience in mind. It's not all about us, but it's about how we can help people through our podcast. In finishing, I want to challenge something that I often hear about podcasts. You often hear something along the lines of, nail your niche. The notion is that we need to be incredibly specific with our audience and topic, and niche right down to the point where there's no other competition in terms of topic or audience for our podcast. But I don't really think in those terms. Obviously, there are huge advantages that come from being a niche podcast and satisfying an audience who absolutely no one has thought about before. But I think of it more in the terms of the less niche you are, the better you have to be. Don't limit yourself if there's a topic or subject that you're absolutely passionate about, but there's others out there who do it too. Just recognize that if you're picking off a popular topic, you have to understand your audience and provide the absolute best podcast for them in that area to ensure that yours is the one that your audience will recommend. So don't think your podcast has to be about something incredibly obscure, but the more popular your topic, the less likely interested people are to come across your podcast organically. But to get across that, just make the absolute best possible podcast that you can make. Tap into your zone of genius and be authentic to your deeper mission and values. And whatever you do, don't just put onions in the oil if you read it on the recipe. So that's all we've got for today. I know it's a bit of a broad topic and it's one that we'll continue to unpack over the course of Individuate. There's plenty about this that I'm really looking forward to getting into. Please check out the podcast page for today at easygoingdigital.com.au/individuate. And please subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already. Thanks for spending some time with me today. I look forward to joining you on the next episode of Individuate.